Great, thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you to all of you that are here tonight. It's a pleasure to be back in Australia, to be back in Brisbane. I was here about 2.5 years ago speaking on the marriage issue, how to properly think about what marriage is and why it matters and what the consequences would be of redefining it. And now we face a different set of questions, how to think about gender, how to think about gender identity. What will be the consequences if activists redefine sex and gender identity? So that's what I want to explore with you a little bit tonight, and especially to think through what we can do to help people who are suffering. There are many people who struggle with their gender identity, who don't feel comfortable in their own bodies. And what is the most compassionate, the most loving, the most authentically caring response to someone who is facing that condition? So that's what I want to kind of go through a little bit tonight. And the way that I want to do this is to start by thinking through what the activists are proposing, because there are radical claims that are being introduced into American society. I'm going to share a lot from the experience in the States, what's going on there. Many of these same things are happening in Australia as well. And when Martin speaks, he'll kind of give you some of that connective tissue about what's going on the other side of the globe is also taking place in your own backyard. But first, what are the activists claiming? And then second, how should we evaluate their claims? How should we make sense of what they're saying? And then I'll close with a couple pieces of practical advice, some stories from the clinical literature. So let me start by saying that the activists are making radical claims about human nature, about the nature of the human person and the nature of the human body in particular. And what they're saying is that a transgender individual, it's not that that individual identifies as the opposite sex. It's that the individual is the opposite sex, that their sex was misassigned at birth, and so therefore modern medicine can reassign sex later in life. Now, this is a change in the arguments that activists have made. It used to be that a transgender woman was a man who identifies as a woman. Now the claim is that a transgender woman is a woman. And you can understand why they make a claim like that. A claim about who someone is much more powerful and persuasive in the public square than a claim about how someone identifies. And so they're making claims that are ontological or metaphysical in nature, but they're dressing them up as if they're scientific claims. Because in our culture, the high priests aren't the philosophers and the theologians. The high priests are the doctors and the scientists. So they're making what are fundamentally philosophical, metaphysical, ontological claims, and then they're using the authority of science and medicine to try to support those claims. So let me show you one example of this. This comes from the United States, a court case in the United States, and it involves a professor from Duke University who's an expert witness for the government here. On their side of the case, it was the federal government suing the state of North Carolina because the state of North Carolina passed a law that would prevent men from entering women's restrooms and locker rooms. So there we go. She says, from a medical perspective, the appropriate determinant of sex is gender identity. It is counter to medical science to use chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, or secondary sex characteristics to override gender identity for purposes of classifying someone as male or female. Now, this is a remarkable claim for several reasons. First is that historically the word gender, as applied to people, was used in contradistinction to sex. The argument from a generation ago was that sex was merely a biological given, and then gender was a social construct. Now the activists are saying that gender identity determines the sex of an individual. Right? So it's not that it's a male who identifies as a female. They actually are a female. Again, a generation ago, the bread and butter of medical science, chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, and secondary sex characteristics. Today, the activists are telling us that it's counter to medical science to point to any of those objective realities if they're in conflict with someone's subjective identity. That's one of the changes that's taking place. And it's not just taking place in courtrooms. This is also taking place in classrooms. And not just in the United States, but also here in Australia. And they've devised cartoon character graphics to help indoctrinate children into how to think about their own gender identities, and how to think about their own bodies, how to think about their own human nature. And so one of the first, it's known as the genderbread person. And you'll see that the genderbread person claims that when it comes to our sexual and gender selves, that we have 5 different aspects of ourselves. And so at the very top, you'll see the arrow that points to the multicolored brain. It says identity, and then in the upper right-hand corner of that, you see gender identity, which it defines as, quote, how you, in your head, define your gender, based on how much you align or don't align with what you understand to be the options for gender. And then the graphic lists, quote, 4 of infinite possibilities. There's womanness, manness, two-spirit, and genderqueer. And you'll notice that those things exist along a spectrum. There's an arrow, and at the larger arrow has the womanness, manness, and then the 4 little boxes. There's woman, man, two-spirit, and genderqueer. And it's identifying where along the spectrum are they placing those dots. And so they're telling school children that they need to think about their own gender identity. Where do they exist along this spectrum? Where should they be placing themselves? But then right below gender identity, they have gender expression. They define this as the way you present gender through your actions, dress, and demeanor. This could be feminine or masculine, butch or femme, androgynous, or gender neutral. And again, it exists along spectrum. So you see the arrows, you see the 4 boxes with little marks somewhere along the arrows. And so your children and grandchildren are going to have to define for themselves, they're being taught in school, that they have to identify their gender identity, their gender expression. Below that, it has biological sex, which also exists along spectrums, you'll notice. So there's femaleness and maleness. And then below that, it has sexual attraction and romantic attraction. And so your kids are being told that 4 of these things need not have any relation to the 5th. That gender identity, gender expression, sexual attraction, and romantic attraction need not have any necessary relationship to their biological sex. That their biological sex could be one thing, and their gender identity, gender expression could be something else. Their romantic and sexual attractions could be something else. Even those don't necessarily have to line up. You could be romantically attracted in one way and sexually attracted in a different way. That's what children are being taught about their own bodies, their own identities. Now, this version of the genderbread person, it's version 3.3. So you notice at the very top, V3.3. This is the most up-to-date version of the genderbread person, and it still got in trouble for being politically incorrect. For 2 reasons. The first is that the genderbread person looks too much like a man. And so it was criticized for contributing to the patriarchy. They said it looks too much like a gingerbread man. The second and more substantive critique was that it says biological sex. And that's now a politically incorrect term. So the new graphic is the gender unicorn. And so what you'll notice is right in the middle of the graphic, you have sex assigned at birth. That's the new term of art. Your sex is merely assigned at birth, and therefore modern medicine can reassign it later in life because it might have been misassigned in the first place. You'll also notice that this is a unicorn, a mythical creature that doesn't exist. So there's actually a certain amount of fittingness. I don't think the activists realized that as they chose the unicorn. But you'll also notice that it looks like Barney. This is meant to be attractive to young kids, to shape their moral imaginations. So when the graphic comes out and many of you kind of laugh at it, it's so ridiculous, realize that for your children and your grandchildren, they might be persuaded by this. They'll find it attractive and appealing. And then it indoctrinates them. That's how it's subtly insidious. Because all of us, no matter what our age is, we interpret our own thoughts and feelings and experiences according to certain background assumptions, according to certain core convictions, according to certain fundamental beliefs. And the question is, will those core convictions, core beliefs, that background script, will it be the gender unicorn? So that if you are going through a stage in which you don't feel comfortable in your own body, where you feel distress with your bodily sex, will you interpret that as a sign that your gender identity and gender expression exists somewhere else along a spectrum than your, quote, sex assigned at birth? Right? Because how we respond to our thoughts and our feelings and our experiences is just as important as those thoughts, feelings, and experiences themselves. And the gender unicorn is giving a new generation of young people a new script on how to interpret and make sense of their own lives. Now, why do they say sex assigned at birth? The people who made this graphic, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, it's the Trans Student Educational Resources. They explain, biological sex is an ambiguous word that has no scale and no meaning, besides that it is related to some sex characteristics. It is also harmful to trans people. Instead, we prefer sex assigned at birth, which provides a more accurate description of what biological sex may be trying to communicate. That's what your children and grandchildren will be taught as well. This is why they're changing biological sex to sex assigned at birth. Now, from this vision of the human person, this vision of the human body and our identity, that then gives rise to the proposals that I will call transgender medicine. So it's from the transgender worldview, how it understands human nature, that then informs the proposals that it makes, the standard of care that is now the official treatment protocol for children with gender dysphoria. And it's a 4-part standard of care, so let me just run through these 4 steps. The first step for a child as young as 3 years old, if the child is persistent, insistent, and consistent that they're the opposite sex, that child should be given a new name, should be given a new pronoun, should be given a new wardrobe, and should be given access to new bathrooms and locker rooms and sports teams. It's called social transition. So for the first step for a child, quote, trapped in the wrong body, is to socially transition them into living out their, quote, true gender identity. So first step is social transition for children as young as 3. And I'm not making this up because you can see mainstream magazines that are profiling children this young who are socially transitioning. Second, as that child now approaches puberty, they should be prevented from going through puberty in the, quote, wrong body. So they're using puberty-blocking drugs to indefinitely block the normal human development that would take place at puberty. So that boys don't mature and develop into men, so that girls don't mature and develop into women. This then leads to the third step, because now you have a problem. You now have a teenager who is still trapped in a child's body, while all of their classmates have developed. So the third step is to try to initiate puberty in the correct body. So they'll give testosterone to teenage girls and give estrogen to teenage boys at ages 14, 15, and 16. And this will try to mimic the development that would have taken place by giving them the opposite sex's sex hormones. And then fourth, the technical age at which this is supposed to take place is at age 18. Some activists are now pushing it for as young as 16. Martin will tell you about a case here in Australia where it happened to a 15-year-old. And this is surgical reassignment, where they will perform surgery on a teenager's body to remove secondary sex characteristics. The case that Martin will mention involves a double mastectomy for a 15-year-old girl. They could remove external genitalia. They could remove internal reproductive organs. And then cosmetic surgery to try to create something that resembles the opposite sex's characteristics. Why do the doctors propose this? We go back to that federal court in the United States. Peer-reviewed research demonstrates that pre-pubertal children asserting a different gender identity from the one they were assigned at birth are cognitively capable enough to be aware of the gender they are asserting. The meaning of a child's gender identity assertion at a younger age is no less valid than the meaning of a gender identity assertion of an older child. So the reason that they'll do social transition for the 5-year-old and puberty blockers for the 10-year-old is that they're cognitively capable enough to know that they're actually the opposite sex. And so the physicians are supposed to give into that. So in the next slide, you'll see children know a lot about themselves and their gender from a very early age. And whether they reveal themselves to be gender expansive, transgender, or neither, the most important thing we can do is listen to what our children are telling us and really hear them. Not try to teach our children, not try to help them develop a more mature understanding of these issues, but to hear them, listen to them, and therefore do what they're telling us. A professor at the University of California in San Francisco and the director of mental health at their Child and Adolescent Gender Care Center explains that like left-handed people, our young transgender people are only a small minority of the general population. And like left-handed people, they are a variation of human development that is to be celebrated and honored rather than punished or denied, as if those are the only two options. And they are our best teachers in alerting us to the reality that gender exists primarily between our ears, in our brains and minds, and not necessarily by what is between our legs, our genitalia, or in our accompanying XX or XY chromosomes, as many are mistakenly prone to believe. We demonstrate how much we have yet to learn when we say, but honey, you can't be a girl, you're a boy because you have a penis. Boys have penises and girls have vaginas. This same doctor continues, speaking of these children, they refuse to pin themselves down as either male or female. Maybe they're a boy-girl, or a gender hybrid, or gender ambidextrous, moving freely between genders, living somewhere in between, or creating their own mosaic of gender identity and expression. As they grow older, they might identify themselves as agender, or gender neutral, or gender queer. Each of these children is exercising their gender creativity, and we can think of them as our gender creative children. And yet, in the very same breath that this doctor says that as the child grows older, the gender identity may change, she also advocates for puberty-blocking drugs and cross-sex hormones to make radical and permanent changes to a child's body. And if you were a parent of a child who was struggling with his or her gender identity, and you went to the Child and Adolescent Gender Care Clinic at the University of California in San Francisco, this might be the advice that you received. This doctor, again, is the director of mental health at the hospital. And so imagine the terrible situation that parents find themselves in when this is what the experts are telling them is in the best interest for their child. From this vision of the person gave rise to the vision for medicine. It also then gives us the demands that activists are making when it comes to public policy and law. And so I just want to mention 4 aspects of the public policy questions. The first, what will your child be taught in school about sex and gender identity? Will your child be subjected to the gender unicorn and the genderbread person? That's one set of issues. Will the Safe Schools program, an anti-bullying program, actually be an indoctrination program? Not to teach your child not to pick on other people, but to teach your child that he or she has to believe that gender is fluid and that it exists along a spectrum and that he or she could be trapped in the wrong body. What's actually going to be taught as the truth about human nature? The second aspect of these public policy questions are, how will we determine how to do access to bathrooms, locker rooms, showers, sports teams, dorm rooms, hotel rooms for overnight field trips? Will we do it based on biology, or will we do it based on gender identity? So will we say that anyone who identifies as a girl can go into the girls' bathroom and locker room and showers and play on the girls' sports teams, and live in the girls' dorms and stay in the girls' hotel room? Or will we say it's based on your actual body and bodily existence? One or the other. Third, will you be free to speak what you believe to be the truth, or will you be forced to speak someone else's truth? And what I mean by this is that in New York City, you can be fined $250,000 if you intentionally misgender someone. So if you use the wrong name or the wrong pronouns knowingly, you could be fined $250,000. So will you be able to speak what you believe to be true, or will you be forced to speak what someone else believes to be true? And then lastly, how will we govern the provision of medical services? And what I mean about this is, will doctors be forced to perform sex reassignment procedures? Will healthcare plans be forced to pay for them? In the United States, in the last year of the previous presidential administration, the Department of Health and Human Services tried to force every healthcare plan in the nation to pay for sex reassignment procedures and all relevant physicians to perform them. So that if you were a hormone specialist that did testosterone therapy for men with low testosterone, you would have to perform it for a woman who wants to identify as a man. If you were a surgeon who would perform a double mastectomy in the case of cancer, you would also have to perform it for a woman who wants to transition to living as a man. This mandate, it had no religious liberty exemptions, it had no conscience protections, and it had no considerations at all for best medical judgment. Many physicians, regardless of their religious beliefs or their moral beliefs, simply think it's bad medicine to give a teenage girl testosterone or to remove both of her breasts. And had they declined to do that under this mandate, they would have been guilty of an unlawful form of discrimination. Thankfully, one of our judges struck down that mandate, and then the Trump administration has rescinded it. But as soon as we have a new presidential administration that's on the left side of the political spectrum, we can see this coming up again. And you're going to have to wrestle with this in your own country. These are the sorts of policy questions. Let me give you one. I'm going to skip a slide and then go to the next slide. This is about schools and how they're going to govern schools. They say, ultimately, the school environment must be set up so that transgender girls are treated like all other girls and transgender boys like all other boys. Now remember, what is a transgender girl? It's a boy who identifies as a girl. So this means that high school transgender girl, that high school boy who is identifying as a girl, has to be treated like all other girls when it comes to bathrooms and locker rooms and showers and dorms and hotel rooms and sports teams. That's what's being argued here. This is a guidebook that was produced by the ACLU, so our largest left-leaning civil liberties law firm, 3 different LGBT activist organizations, and then the National Education Association, the largest teachers union in the United States. So you see this partnership of the teachers, the lawyers, and the activists coming together to jointly produce the guidelines. And ultimately, the school has to be set up so that that boy who identifies as a girl is treated like all the other girls. This has particularly concerning, it raises particularly concerning questions about parental involvement and parental authority. So later in this same book, they write, privacy and confidentiality are critically important for transgender students who do not have supportive families. In those situations, even inadvertent disclosures could put the student in a potentially dangerous situation at home. So it is important to have a plan in place to help avoid any mistakes or slip-ups. What are they talking about by this? They mean they want to set up the school environment so your child or your grandchild can transition at school without you knowing about it. If you are, quote, a unsupportive family, that's when it's important so the school has a plan in place to avoid any, quote, inadvertent disclosures, to avoid any mistakes or slip-ups. What these plans look like, it would be a way in which you could drop off your son at school at 8 a.m. and he would go to the principal's office where a new wardrobe would be waiting for him. And he could change into a dress, put on nail polish, lipstick, makeup, and spend the day at school presenting as if a girl, be referred to by a new name and with a new pronoun throughout the school day. At the end of the day, go back to the principal's office, change back into his original clothes, take off the makeup and the lipstick and the nail polish, and be picked up by you without you ever knowing what's going on at school. They even have a way, and this is what they mean when they say they have a plan in place, to ensure that inside of school, they'll use the new name and the new pronoun, but externally, when communicating with you, the parents, they'll go back to using the given name and the proper pronoun, entirely to undermine your role as parent. Okay, so let's pivot to start evaluating this. I said the first step here was to understand what the activists are claiming. The second step is to start evaluating it. And what I first want to do in evaluating is point out some of the philosophical contradictions. My PhD is in political philosophy. And so when I was doing research for the book, the things that kept jumping off the page to me were all of the philosophical contradictions. When they're saying both X and not X simultaneously about the same thing at the same time, and they can't both be true. And those were leaping up at me. And here it's important to clarify that the contradictions and what I'm going to be critiquing for the next little bit of this presentation are what the activists are saying. And it's important to distinguish the activists from ordinary people who might experience gender dysphoria, from ordinary people who might struggle with their gender identity, from ordinary people who identify as transgender. Most of those people, they're not activists of any sort. They're not ideologues. They don't believe the gender unicorn and the gender-bred person. They're simply trying to make the best of a bad situation. They're simply trying to do the best they can to cope with their struggles. And so my comments aren't directed at them. Frequently, they're the victims of the activists. Because it's those doctors who I've quoted that have told them that transitioning is what's best. So my critique here is directed at the activists and at their philosophically incoherent worldview. And many of these activists, they don't identify as transgender, right? These are white, upper middle class, cisgender men who are frequently behind much of this ideology. And so I'm addressing the ideology here. So the first thing to say is that the transgender worldview, it combines a new form of the ancient philosophy of Gnosticism while simultaneously embracing materialism. Now, Gnosticism, it claims that the real self is something other than the material body. Materialism claims that only material bodies exist. Both of them can't be true at the same time. And yet you look at the activists who promote this worldview, almost all of them are materialists, and yet they say that I could be trapped in the wrong material body. Who is the I that is trapped in the wrong material body if you're a materialist? Right? They have a form of dualism in which my body isn't me and where I'm not my body. It's philosophically incoherent. They insist that, quote, gender exists primarily between our ears, in our brains and minds, and not necessarily by what is between our legs. And yet they also propose radical therapeutic interventions to radically transform what's between our legs. If gender exists primarily between our ears, why can't you just be a boy who enjoys playing with dolls? Why do you have to block puberty in that boy's body? Why do you have to give that boy estrogen? So again, you can see that contradiction. The worldview, it relies on rigid sex stereotypes in which boys play with trucks and girls play with dolls, yet it insists that gender is purely a social construct, so that there are no meaningful differences between men and women or boys and girls. And yet it also insists that gender identity is real and meaningful, but the facts of human embodiment are not. All of that simultaneously. And then it embraces radical expressive individualism, where people should be free to do whatever they want to do and to define the truth however they wish it to be. But it also enforces ruthless paternalism, to punish and coerce anyone who doesn't agree with transgender ideology. So it's freedom for me, conformity for thee. Now, there's some questions that we can ask ourselves and that you can put to friends and family who are trying to think through this. What does it mean to have an internal sense of gender? So they define gender identity as your, quote, internal sense of gender. What does gender feel like? Apart from having a body that is male or female, what does it feel like to be a man or a woman? How would I, as a man with a male body, know what it feels like to feel like a woman? Right? There's an epistemological problem here. Epistemology just being the philosopher's big word for knowledge. There's a knowledge problem. How could any of us know what it feels like to be the opposite sex? Or for that matter, to be both sex? Because remember they said that you could be both a boy and a girl. Or to be neither sex. How would we know what those feelings feel like? Now, even if we could answer that question, why should feeling like a man make someone a man? So even if I knew what it is to feel like a woman, why should my feeling like a woman make me a woman? Our feelings don't determine more or less anything else in our lives. Our feelings don't determine our age or our height or our weight or our race. So why do our feelings determine our sex? To a certain extent, gender identity sounds a lot like religion. And what I mean by this is that these are identities that are determined by beliefs. So think about religious identity. A Christian is someone who identifies as a Christian is someone who believes that Jesus is the Christ. Someone who identifies as a Muslim believes that Muhammad is the prophet. But Jesus either is or is not the Christ, regardless of what any of us believe. Muhammad either is or is not the prophet, regardless of what any of us believe. And the same is true about our own sexed identity. Someone either is or is not a man, regardless of what any of us, including that individual, believes. Right? The truth of the matter is independent of our beliefs about the truth of the matter. So in religious life, what we try to do is we try to conform our beliefs to the reality about God. Right? We don't try to create God in our own image. We try to figure out what's true about God and conform our beliefs to that. That's what conversion is all about. The same should be true when it comes to gender identity. We should try to align our thoughts and our feelings with the truth about our bodies, rather than trying to transform our bodies in accordance with our thoughts and feelings. And that leads to the second step of evaluating these claims. What are the bodily outcomes? So let's start with the bodily, the physical, and then we'll go to some of the psychosocial outcomes. Contrary to the claims of the activists, sex isn't assigned at birth, and that's why it can't be reassigned later in life. Sex is a bodily reality that can be recognized well before birth. Most people find out the sex of their children around 20 weeks gestation, when an ultrasound technician asks them, do you want to know the sex of your child? So it's not assigned at birth. It's also not assigned at ultrasound. That technician isn't assigning a sex to the child. The technician is doing what all of us do. We recognize the sex of another individual. We recognize a reality about that individual and their body and the way that it's organized. Organisms, including human organisms, are organized in certain ways. And how we are organized with respect to sexual reproduction determines what our sex is. And there are two ways of being organized with respect to sexual reproduction. There's a male and there's a female way. And this organization starts in the womb. It begins with conception, with the chromosomes that we inherit from our mother and father. Those chromosomes then influence the development of certain internal reproductive organs, which produce certain hormones, which then develop certain external genitalia, which then develop certain secondary sex characteristics. You notice the words I'm just using there. Contrary to what that professor from Duke University says, that is how doctors and scientists identify the sex of an individual across the animal kingdom, not just in human beings, but across the organisms. You look at how an organism is organized with respect to sexual reproduction to determine the sex of the organism. These things take place in the womb, and they can't be reassigned later in life. So what happens is that you can have cosmetic surgery and cross-sex hormones. They don't change this deeper underlying biological reality. What they do is they feminize a male body or they masculinize a female body. So Dr. Lawrence Mayer, scientifically speaking, transgender men are not biological men, and transgender women are not biological women. The claims to the contrary are not supported by a scintilla of scientific evidence. Or Robert George at Princeton University, changing sexes is a metaphysical impossibility because it is a biological impossibility. So that's on the physical level. What about on the psychosocial level? And here, just as sex reassignment fails to reassign sex physically, it also fails to bring the wholeness and the happiness that the patients are looking for when it comes to their psychosocial outcomes. The medical evidence suggests that even when the surgery and the hormone therapy are successful as a cosmetic matter, and even in cultures that are relatively trans-friendly, people who transition still face a host of elevated risks when it comes to their long-term happiness and wholeness. Here, Dr. Paul McHugh at Johns Hopkins explains, transgender men do not become women, nor do transgender women become men. And this was in an essay that he wrote after Bruce had transitioned to Caitlin. And I can see people are taking pictures. That's wonderful. Take pictures of the slides if you want. Everything that I'm quoting more or less is in the book. So if you're looking for the full citation of any of the slides, you can find the full quote with chapter and verse and page number and everything in the book. But feel free to take pictures as we go on. So McHugh says, transgender men do not become women, transgender women do not become men. All, including Bruce Jenner, become feminized men or masculinized women, counterfeits or impersonators of the sex with which they identify. In that lies their problematic future. When the tumult and shouting dies, it proves not easy nor wise to live in a counterfeit sexual garb. The most thorough follow-up of sex reassigned people, extending over 30 years and conducted in Sweden, where the culture is strongly supportive of the transgender, documents their lifelong mental unrest. 10 to 15 years after surgical reassignment, the suicide rate of those who had undergone sex reassignment surgery rose to 20 times that of comparable peers. Dr. McHugh was the chair of psychiatry in Johns Hopkins for over 25 years, and it was under his watch back in the 1970s that he had Hopkins shut down their sex reassignment clinic. McHugh had asked his colleagues to do a study of what the long-term outcomes were for the patients at Hopkins who had been sexually reassigned, and the outcomes weren't very pretty. And so McHugh, as chair of psychiatry, psychiatrist-in-chief at Johns Hopkins, had the hospital shut down the sex reassignment clinic. And it remained shut down until a year and a half ago, when it was reopened, largely due to political pressure. But it's not just McHugh who is saying this. It's not just that study from Sweden. The Guardian, not Australia's Guardian, but the UK's Guardian, back in 2004, commissioned a study from Birmingham University. And so the next slide is a quote from the Guardian's paper summarizing the study that they had asked Birmingham University to conduct. And you'll see they asked Birmingham University's Aggressive Research Intelligence Facility to assess over 100 studies of post-op transsexuals, and they found that none of the studies provides conclusive evidence that gender reassignment is beneficial for patients. And then it went on to note that the research was poorly designed, which skewed the results in favor of changing sexes. That the people conducting the studies have a vested interest in the outcome of the studies. And there were no evaluations of whether other treatments such as long-term counseling might help, or whether their gender confusion might lessen over time. That was in 2004. So let's go a decade after that, 2014. A consulting company in the United States called Hayes Incorporation, it provides consulting to hospitals and healthcare plans to tell them what to cover and what not to cover, what to provide, what not to provide. Statistically significant improvements have not been consistently demonstrated. That's the bottom line from Hayes. And then it points out the various weaknesses with the studies. That's in 2014. Don't just take it from McHugh and Hopkins or the Swedish study or the UK or Hayes. Take it from the Obama administration less than 2 years ago. This is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services in June of 2016. Based on a thorough review of the clinical evidence at this time, there is not enough evidence to determine whether gender reassignment surgery improved health outcomes for Medicare beneficiaries with gender dysphoria. There were conflicting, inconsistent results. Of the best designed studies, some reported benefits while others reported harms. The quality and strength of evidence were low due to the mostly observational study designs with no comparison groups, potential confounding of causes, small sample sizes. And many studies that report positive outcomes were exploratory type studies with no confirmatory follow-up. So this is the Obama administration a year and a half ago admitting that we don't have good evidence to suggest that sex reassignment procedures benefit their patients. And yet we're now encouraging children to think about radically transforming their bodies. And this is in the adult population. And so we have a patient population who is suffering, who's struggling, who's not finding the wholeness and happiness that they're looking for. They're being told by doctors that transition procedures will bring them that wholeness and happiness. And the best science shows that it doesn't actually do so. That was the proposed decision memo, which was June of 2016. In August of 2016, the final decision memo came out. Again, you can see here it points out the quality and strength of the evidence was low, and then it lists all of the problems with those studies. In the next slide, it points out how the majority of these studies weren't longitudinal, meaning long-term. They were exploratory. They didn't include controls or testing prior and after the surgery. And then it points out, it says, after careful assessment, we identified 6 studies that could provide useful information. So think about that. They're proposing radical changes, and they could only find 6 studies that would even provide useful information. And of these, the 4 best conducted studies did not demonstrate clinically significant changes in psychomatic test results after GRS, gender reassignment surgery. So you have patients who are suffering, they're undergoing these radical changes to their bodies, and then the study shows that they're not clinically significant changes afterwards. So whatever it was that led them to go to the doctor to have the reassignment, they're still struggling with all of those same things afterwards. That's what it means when it says that they don't demonstrate clinically significant changes after. And just one last slide on this. They're now discussing one of those rigorous studies. It's the same study that Dr. McHugh mentioned at the beginning of this portion of my talk. The mortality was 19.1 times greater than in control Swedes. And it was primarily due to completed suicides, 19.1 times greater, but also due to a variety of other disease, twice as likelihood at 2.5. And then look at the sentence, we note mortality from this patient's population did not become apparent until after 10 years. So many of the studies that you'll hear the news highlight, the ones that the experts point out are short-term with no confirmatory follow-up, without objective results, with potential confounding. The ones that the media likes to hype that say people turn out just fine, they're pointing out that the rigorous studies show that it's 10 years after that you see some of these poor outcomes begin to manifest. All of this has been discussing adults. So what to think about some of the therapies directed at children. Let me just mention 3 things that I think it'll be important for you to know about this. The first is that they're entirely experimental. There's not a single long-term study on the long-term consequences of indefinitely blocking puberty in a child. They simply don't know what will happen. They're using a drug that was developed and tested and then FDA approved for treating a different condition. This drug was approved for treating a condition known as precocious puberty, which is the early onset of puberty. And it was developed and tested and approved to be used to delay puberty to the biologically age-appropriate time. They're now using this drug to indefinitely delay puberty, well beyond the biologically appropriate time. When puberty is commencing at the biologically appropriate time, they're using this drug to block it so that it never takes place. And we have no idea what the long-term consequences are, entirely experimental. And just think of all of the physical changes that take place in a human body during puberty in terms of height and weight, bone length and bone density, your musculature, your organ development, all of these changes that take place in coordinated, integrated ways. And we have no idea what it would mean for a child to have that blocked and then at age 16 to go on the opposite sex's sex chromosomes, sex hormones. So that's the first. It's experimental. Second, the experts claim that it's, quote, fully reversible. What they mean by this is that they hope that if you go off the puberty-blocking drug, puberty would recommence. So that if you start going on it at age 10 and then at age 16 you change your mind and you go off of it, puberty would then start up. That's their hope. But it's an Orwellian abuse of language to claim that it's fully reversible after you just blocked 5 or 6 years of puberty. Going through development at age 16 that you were supposed to go through at age 10 or 11 and 12 doesn't fully reverse it. And again, we have no idea what those consequences would be. And then third and finally, many experts fear that it might be self-fulfilling. And what I mean by this is that ordinarily, the best science that we have on this shows somewhere between 80 to 95% of children who struggle with their gender identity will naturally grow out of it. It'll just be a stage that they will go through that they will then come out of. And so the boy who's feeling uncomfortable as a boy, a year or two later will be identifying as a boy again, 80 to 95% of the times. But the children in the Dutch clinic that pioneered this treatment protocol, 100% of them persisted in their identification as transgender. And so it's led some therapists to fear that what's happening when you take the 5-year-old boy and you socially transition him, and then you take the 10-year-old boy and you give him puberty-blocking drugs, you're reinforcing the transgender identity. What neuroscientists now know is the reality of neuroplasticity. Our brains are very plastic. They're constantly rewiring themselves. And after 10 years of living as if the opposite sex, and of them blocking puberty, you may be reinforcing that identification. And you may be blocking the very developmental process that would help get the child out of the gender-confused stage. It may be the rush of testosterone at puberty that helps that boy feel comfortable being a boy again. And that by blocking his puberty, you're actually blocking the developmental pathway that would help him consolidate his gender identity. That's the concern there. All right, so let me start wrapping up because it's time for me to wrap up. Let me mention one very sad potential outcome, and then I want to mention two good potential outcomes. The sad outcome involves a chapter of the book, chapter 3. It was the hardest for me to research and write because it involves people who transitioned thinking that it would bring them that wholeness and that happiness. And then 5 or 10 or 15 years later, they detransitioned because it hadn't brought them that happiness. And they finally found help that they needed to identify the underlying causes of their gender dysphoria. And then they went back to identifying and living with their biological sex. These stories are almost never told in the mainstream media. They won't have a 2-hour special on one of the primetime news magazine shows like Bruce Jenner did. Many of them will be anonymous. They will never be known. But people are starting to tell their stories on YouTube and on blogs. And the stories are heartbreaking. Many of them, especially those who transitioned as teenagers, they report now that they were much too young to be making such life-altering decisions as teens. So contrary to what that doctor says about being cognitively capable enough, they weren't cognitively capable enough. They now regret the permanent harm that they've done to their bodies, the permanent damage. In many cases, their lost fertility, their inability to bear children. And many of them report that it's people like me, and so by implication, some people like you, who are partly to blame. That it's conservative evangelicals and Catholics, the religious right, who are too rigid in their expectations for gender roles. And they're too stigmatizing of people who struggle with their gender identity. And so I mention that just as a caution that we need to be careful that as we advocate for the truth, that we don't stigmatize people who are already struggling, and that we don't contribute to a culture in which people will feel more uncomfortable in their own bodies because of the expectations that we impose on them. Just a word of caution. But we also shouldn't go to the opposite extreme of endorsing the claims that the activists are making. What we have to do is find the way of speaking the truth in charity. So let me just read a series of quotes from one of these young women. I was put on hormones after 3 months of therapy at the age of 17. In fact, because I was only seeing a therapist once per month, it was after 3 or 4 visits that I was prescribed testosterone, with no meaningful attempt made to process the issues that I brought up that led in part to my wish to transition. When I was transitioning, no one in the medical or psychological field ever tried to dissuade me, to offer other options, to do really anything to stop me besides telling me I should wait till I was 18. I want to ask you, how many other medical conditions are there where you can walk into the doctor's office, tell them you have a certain condition, which has no objective test, which can be caused by trauma or mental health issues or societal factors, and receive life-altering medications on your say-so? She continues, I think the prospect of completely changing your body, your life, your identity, is very compelling to a teenager who is just learning to cope with mental health issues, with trauma, with gender nonconformance, with being a lesbian. And that's especially true when the current rhetoric around transition really discourages any kind of questioning. It really frames transitioning or trans identity as the solution to any kind of gender issue or gender confusion. And I think it's really important for therapists not to frame transition as the only solution, to really present options and to encourage people not to take their feelings and urges entirely at face value, to be critical, to really think about where those thoughts are coming from. And then finally, I wanted to make a video previously so that folks can see that I'm a real live person, but didn't out of fear of showing my face. But I think it's important when we talk about these issues to really understand that women like us aren't just statistics, not just some dry data some gatekeeping doctor might throw at you. We're real people. This is a real outcome of transition. I'm a real live 22-year-old woman with a scarred chest and a broken voice and 5 o'clock shadow because I couldn't face the idea of growing up to be a woman. That's my reality. And so the question for all of us is, how many other people will face this reality, and what can we do to try to prevent that? What can we do that's constructive and effective to try to help people who are struggling? When Carrie mentions that she has a scarred chest and a broken voice and 5 o'clock shadow, that's the result of 5 years of taking testosterone and of having a double mastectomy. Her voice will never come back once the vocal cords have lengthened and thickened. She won't get her original voice back. Her breasts won't grow back. She could have surgery to have implants, but these are life-altering changes that she made. And as she points out, she was much too young She wasn't in a, quote, cognitively capable position to be making these decisions. So what does that alternative look like? What would someone like Dr. Paul McHugh advise? What was he doing during his 50-some years? He still is practicing medicine today. What he says is that what we should look to is figure out what are the underlying causes of the discomfort, the gender dysphoria. What is it about being a boy that the young child finds distressing? What is it about being a girl that the young child finds attractive or compelling or appealing? What's causing those things? And then address those underlying causes. He draws an analogy, many of the physicians do, between gender dysphoria and other types of bodily discomforts, other types of body image struggles. So frequently you'll see a comparison made to anorexia. And with anorexia, no one would suggest that we give a high school girl struggling with anorexia liposuction. So why do they suggest we give a high school girl struggling with gender dysphoria testosterone? Instead, what they do is they try to help a high school girl struggling with anorexia feel comfortable in her own body. Help her to see that she's not actually obese, that she's not actually overweight, that she's not ugly, that she's attractive the way she is, and that she need not attempt to starve herself. They try to change her thoughts and her feelings to conform to reality. And they try to help her cope when she does have those thoughts and feelings to not act on them in a self-destructive way. And so that's what Dr. McHugh and others suggest for a child with gender dysphoria. Help them, rather than trying to transform the body, help them to align their thoughts and their feelings with the reality of their body, and help them to cope when they have those misguided thoughts and feelings in a way that won't be self-destructive. And so let me give you two examples of this. The first involves a young boy who's identifying as a girl. His parents took him to see a therapist for help on this. And the therapist just started asking questions. Why is it that you think you're actually a girl trapped in a boy's body? What is it about being a boy that you find distressing? What is it about being a girl that you find fulfilling? And what the therapist discovered was that the young boy was being bullied by the other boys in his class. They were picking on him. They were calling him a sissy and a wuss, calling him names, saying he wasn't a real man or a real boy. And as a result of this, his closest friends were all girls. He was forming closer friendships with the girls in his class because the boys were picking on him and bullying him. And now his interests were more stereotypically feminine. And so he, as a way of coping, making sense of his entire life, was thinking that he must be a girl trapped in a boy's body. So the therapist suggested three things to the parents. One, remove your child from this environment. He's in a toxic situation, and the bullying is causing some of the gender dysphoria. Two, keep bringing him back to me so he and I can keep talking about what it really means to be a man and what it really means to be a woman. He's not cognitively capable enough. He has immature ideas about these things because he has very limited life experience. Based upon his limited experience of what it means to be a boy and a girl, he thinks he's not a real boy. We have to help enlarge his knowledge and his understanding. We have to help him mature in his understanding of what it means to be a boy and a girl. So it's not just based on stereotypes. So that he can see that real boys can be sweet, they can be gentle, they can be caring. They don't have to be jerks. And then lastly, they said, it's not enough just to talk to him about this. He needs to experience it. We need to help your son find a new friend group of boys like him so that he can have direct human experiential knowledge that boys can be sweet and caring and kind and share all of his interests, that he's a real boy. So a year later, after pursuing this course of intervention, their son was identifying as a boy again, happily, living out as a boy. He was prevented going through this type of transition and making a video like this. In the other example, and this is where I'll finish, the therapy wasn't directed at the child, but at the parent. It again involves a boy who was identifying as a girl. In the course of talk therapy, the child explained to the therapist, well, I'm a girl because mommies are nicer to girls than they are to boys. And so that pricked up the ears of the therapist to talk to the mother. And they asked, why would your son say something like this? And what the therapist discovered was that the mother had been raped several years earlier, and she had never recovered from that because she never received the care that she deserved. And as a result of her sexual assault, she physically couldn't be as affectionate with her son as she could with her daughter. And her son was subconsciously picking up on this, that his mother was more affectionate with his sister than she was with him, and he was starting to identify as a girl as a way of trying to win over his mother's affection. Not consciously, this is all happening subconsciously. And so what the therapist did was he directed his therapy at the mother. He started helping her recover from her traumatic experience with sexual assault. Once she got the healing that she needed, she was able to be more affectionate with her son. Her son was able to identify as a boy again. And so you can see another example where the therapist identified what the underlying cause was. He addressed those underlying causes, and then people were able to flourish in their own bodies. You have a child spared the experience that Carrie went through. So that's where I'm going to stop. I'll just ask you to think about these things as you hear this debate play out in Australia, and think about what you can do to contribute to this discussion in a constructive way. And then you can go to slido.com if you have any follow-up questions. There'll be a couple other shorter, thankfully, shorter talks. I apologize, I went a little long. And then Martin and I will be back up to answer some of your questions. Thank you.